At any or every point, you have an opportunity to enhance your finished compost product, and depending on your usage of that finished product and what resources you have available at the time of making it will determine how you make it. Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to take some time to talk through the way that I make compost for our farm, and this might seem like a very well-traversed topic and a topic that you have already heard me talk about plenty, but there are still a few reasons that I think that this is going to be a really helpful, useful video to make. First off, the most obvious point being that I've come to realize that there are many things that I take for granted, or pieces of knowledge that I have that I don't say out loud all that much because either one, I don't think to say it seems obvious to me, and two, because honestly I haven't thought about why I actually do the things the way that I do them. So taking the time to write out my thoughts allows me the space to really think through why exactly I'm doing this and how I came to do it this way. All that is to say, I'm going to walk through the process of making compost as simply as possible and then gradually walk through the steps that I've taken, the advances, you could say, in upgrading our compost. And I also want to be honest about how intentional I am with this, how consistent I am with each of these additional components. I don't want this to be taken as prescriptive exactly. There are many paths that you could take. You could even go the no compost route for your garden and have a wonderful, thriving garden. Take certain things from this video, leave other things, I won't be offended. Also, and this is my last caveat, I promise, I'm gonna miss a lot of stuff in this video. I'm gonna just kind of be riffing and sort of trying to converse with you. So if and when I do leave out details, explanations, don't conclude thoughts, please just be sure to comment about it as angrily as possible. Compost is a central piece of the fertility engine on our farm and for our garden. And I want you to have the chance to see the full picture of how we use it. I'm trying to find ways to make this all as transparent as possible, especially as we head into more late stage generative AI reliance. I think it's going to be more important than ever to see what people are actually doing to get results. So if you'd like to skip forward to the actual compost making section where we start with the simplest version and then systematically upgrade it, feel free. I'm going to start by covering some of the reasons that we make compost at all. Why we don't just throw all of our organic matter on the soil and leave it there to decompose instead of doing what we're doing when we make compost at all, which is pre-decomposing materials and then spreading them. Raining for like the first time in 2 minutes. Okay. So just to re-ask that question, why make compost at all? The first and the most obvious answer is to use it in the garden. And you don't want to waste your time and resources making anything that you don't use. So when we use it in the garden, what's happening? In essence, we're supplying the soil with microorganisms. That's probably the biggest benefit of compost. And then additionally, we're supplying the soil with organic matter, which is basically pre-converted nutrients that also help to build soil structure and feed more microorganisms, and eventually it'll feed your plants. So compost is a soil amendment, a gardening input that performs a number of functions. It checks a lot of boxes. I think that the less obvious answer to the question, why make compost, at least less obvious for folks who are gardening in a more conventional manner, is that it's sort of like the gut of the garden. It's the processing center for the food that the plants in the garden will eventually be consuming. So when you eat a meal, chances are there are various degrees of processing that have happened for you to be able to eat that food. And processing food makes the food more or less palatable and more or less digestible. Kind of just running with this example, the least amount of processing that I can think of when it comes to food that you eat would be like eating fruit straight off of the tree without touching it with your hands even. Or if I go over to my tomatoes and I just go tomato on the vine to chomping it with my teeth. And then at that point, I'm still technically processing the food by chewing it. If this seems really pointless, by the way, just be patient. This will hopefully make sense in a moment. Chewing food is processing food. We typically don't swallow fruit whole unless you're a small child, just speaking from my personal observations of my kids. And then when you've swallowed your hopefully chewed up food, then your body does a bunch of different things to further process it. Stomach acids, microbial decomposition, all of which lead your body to being able to utilize nutrients from the food. You're not absorbing tomatoes straight into your blood. You're digesting the tomato so that you can uptake nutrients that are contained within it. That's kind of how I see compost making. It's sort of like simulating a digestive tract for the materials, the food that the garden produces. And by food, I don't mean the food that you're growing for yourself. I mean the food that's getting grown for the garden itself. Food, you might not even realize, is garden food. Now, a compost pile, such as we have here, is not just a pile of random ingredients. It's a set of intentionally pre-processed ingredients that are balanced with other ingredients. It's like a well-balanced meal. You've got some carbs, some fat, some protein on your plate in whatever ratio you prefer to consume those, and you're balancing one with the other macronutrient. Now, if you've ever tried to eat just one thing, like just carbs or just protein or just fat, your body will feel the lack of the other missing ingredients. I'm not a dietitian, don't take this super seriously. It's more of an example to give you an idea of how compost works. If you look at a classic American food, the cheeseburger, there's a couple of things that naturally go with it. Ground beef and cheese are pretty fatty and proteiny. The bun is pretty carby. And so this package rounds itself out. But then there's the sauces that might come with it. A lot of the time, the goal of sauces is to provide an acid source that cuts through the fat in the burger and creates a more balanced mouthfeel. Then you might consider adding a leaf of lettuce and a tomato slice and maybe some pickled onions, a few strips of bacon, some sauteed mushrooms. All of these things that we add to our burgers add flavor, texture, and round out the mouthfeel. Additionally, if you order a burger at a restaurant, most likely you're going to get something alongside that burger, some chips, fries, or a salad, and then a sweet beverage. And all of these components of the meal help to balance out and enhance the experience that you have when you actually go to pound it all down your gullet. But at its core, the only thing that we really need to make it a cheeseburger is that bun, the ground beef patty, and a slice of cheese. For a compost pile, those core ingredients are the carbon-rich materials and the nitrogen-rich materials. And like assembling a burger, the best way to assemble the compost pile is by layering these materials. For the burger, it's bun, burger, cheese, bun. For compost, it's carbon, nitrogen, water. Ha, snuck in a third ingredient. Water is not a food ingredient per se. It's just essential for building your pile though. Now with the compost piles, we got to keep layering carbon, nitrogen, watering down, carbon, nitrogen, water it down, carbon, nitrogen, water it down until we reach a certain height to the pile. And at this point, I should probably say that we are walking through the process of building a compost pile that generates heat, right? Heat is the primary thing that speeds up decomposition of our materials, getting them into a state that is more readily uptaken into the bloodstream of the garden. So we're gonna try to make that happen. Once a pile reaches around a meter high or about 3 feet high, 3 feet in diameter, microorganisms will begin their feast. And to help them with that feast, we have to chew the burger, which with the compost pile means that we mix up the materials every so often. We can do this every day, we can do this every few days, but flipping the pile adds oxygen back into the pile and it mixes things up, and it's kind of like chewing the materials. It's fast decomposition, at least where speed is a factor that's under our control. When you flip, you also want to check for moisture content, at least I do. I almost always add in more water when I flip. I'll pause here to say that when it comes to how much water that you need to add exactly, will depend largely on the humidity of your climate. You watch a Charles Dowding compost video and he doesn't even add water most of the time. Most likely, it's because he's making compost in England. It's not a place lacking in humidity. For my really dry, arid, high desert type climate, I find myself needing to add a fair bit of supplemental water. The moisture coming off of the materials in England is just much more likely to be a higher amount than the general moisture coming off of my materials. The reason that we need moisture is because the microbes need moisture to continue to stay active. But it's also because if, like me, you're dealing with bone dry materials, chances are high that those materials are hydrophobic, meaning that they won't absorb water well. And one of the primary reasons that we make compost is for its water carrying capacity that it brings to the soil. So as you're building this pile, you don't want to just build it and then dump all of the water that it needs on the top because it'll run off. You want to add moisture as you build. You're giving it time to absorb that moisture so that it doesn't run off. If you see moisture beading off of your compost, add more slowly or more spread out and stay consistent. I will sometimes set up a sprinkler or a hose to run on low on my compost pile so that it gradually moistens the material. You don't want these sopping wet and mucky. Once they've absorbed the water, they should be just damp to the touch. If you stick your hand in the pile after a few days and it's bone dry, you didn't have enough moisture, you want it at that wrung out sponge wetness. And I realize this is getting pretty granular here. I just want to point out things as they kind of come up so that I don't miss them and leave you with unsolved issues. Something else that I should have said earlier is that you want to layer your carbon-rich materials with your nitrogen-rich materials in roughly equal amounts. And this will definitely depend on what the exact ingredients are. Nitrogen-rich materials consist of green material, grass clippings, crop residue, and weeds, but also coffee grounds, food scraps, bokashi fermented food scraps, which we'll get into in a bit, livestock manure. Carbon materials are typically more dry, woody ingredients like wood chips, dried leaves, dried plant material, cardboard, straw. All of these things have their unique carbon to nitrogen ratios, so keep that in mind. But all in all, this is pretty intuitive stuff. If you take a dried leaf and compare it to a wood chip, which one of those is closer to being recognized as finished compost or even looking like soil? The dried leaf crumbles in your hands, or at least breaks apart really easily, you probably can't crush a wood chip with your hand, with your bare hand. Well decomposed wood chips that are really, really old, maybe you can, and those would maybe decompose quickly in a pile. We might think of this as the difference between a raw potato and a French fry, if we're sticking with the cheeseburger image, which I am. It's far easier to consume a potato's worth of French fries than a raw potato. Same kind of goes for the microbes in your compost pile. Leaves are sort of like French fries. Wood chips are maybe more like raw potato, except that we're looking at a lot longer period of decomposition for both things. Sometime a long time ago, I set out to answer the question, why make compost? And then I started talking about cheeseburgers. So let's revisit that question now that we've talked through the basics of building a hot compost pile. Let's say that you've got 3 friends that come over for dinner and you're making them, you guessed it, cheeseburgers for dinner. But when they sit down to eat, you give one person 3 slices of cheese, one person 3 buns, and one person 3 hamburger patties. It's a little lopsided. That's sort of what it feels like happens in our gardens when we dump grass clippings on one garden bed, dried leaves on another garden bed, wood chips on another garden bed, and food scraps on yet another garden bed. Maybe it's a little more ideal and friendly to our soil and the plants that will live there to combine these things first and then redistribute them as complete cheeseburgers. Sort of. I guess it's more like we redistribute them as fermented, kind of rotting cheeseburgers. Point is, the compost making site is a place where all of the ingredients can come together, get mixed up with intentionality, and then get redistributed across the garden. It also gives you the opportunity to sneak in extra ingredients that perhaps you only have a little bit of or you can't use directly on your garden soil. Compost acts, at least for us, as a sort of waste processing site. Its main function is to turn waste materials into valuable soil. That's why all of our food waste goes through our compost. Now, you probably know that the main way we do this is by preparing our food waste in advance, treating it, in a sense, by pre-fermenting it. We do this with the bokashi method. It's something that we've done for years. We still love it. So much so that we now sell the brand that we make for ourselves to use. You can get it in our online store. It's a source of nitrogen material, but it's a really unique source of nitrogen. As I've mentioned several times so far, the goal of compost, or at least one goal of compost, is to get these materials more ready, closer to being able to being bioavailable nutrients for our plants to consume. And so pre-fermenting food scraps is a way of speeding up that process even more. It's also a way of handling food scraps as you go. You may have noticed that when we build piles to make hot compost, it's all at once. We don't layer dried leaves and then toss a few food scraps on top, and then a few days later add a few more food scraps, and then after a few more days add some more dry leaves, and then for a few more days add some wood chips and more food scraps. We want a lot all at once so that we can finish making the pile. So with bokashi, we slowly add to our buckets. While we've got our food scraps, we ferment them, let that culture get established and pre-digest them, and then we compost them all at once, usually 2 to 3 buckets at a time, which is 10 to 15 gallons. Now, comment below if you have ever had a kimchi burger. I have, and it's delicious. Kimchi is a Korean fermented cabbage condiment that also contains ginger and garlic and chili peppers and a whole lot of other ingredients. It's really tasty to me. But it also contains probiotics, beneficial bacteria that help with the digestion of the ingredients themselves, but also supplies our guts with healthy microbial cultures. Bokashi is kind of like adding kimchi to the burger of compost. The same category of bacteria is actually the primary fermenter, lactic acid bacteria. And when we add these microbes to our compost pile, which at this point in the image is both our cheeseburger and the gut, where it's getting digested, but when we add this lactic acid bacteria culture, we're feeding the gut healthy probiotics. We're aiding in digestion. We're making the ingredients easier to break down and become bioavailable nutrients. Culturing our food scraps in this way before composting them is what allows you to compost meat and dairy and cooked foods very easily, by the way. And so those are some of the benefits of using bokashi, at least for us. It's actually a pretty simple process. There's really nothing fancy about it. But in another sense, that's why we like using it so much. There's a direct result or benefit added that we can see. So we've got our kimchi burger, added probiotics. It's gonna taste good when we bite into it, but there are a few other things that we can add at this point as well. 2 categories, and I'm gonna call those categories the secret sauces and then the giblets. For the secret sauces, at this point in the game, temperatures haven't risen. We're not cooking anything yet, but we're going to. So we don't want to add or encourage any particularly delicate or temp sensitive microbes at this point. The temperatures of a hot compost pile are going to reach up beyond 130 Fahrenheit. The lactic acid bacteria in the bokashi is going to help those thermophilic bacteria get established so that the pile can heat up in such a way. But we wouldn't want to add a special fungal culture at this point because then we're going to kill it off. And we'll come back to that later. A secret sauce that you might add though could be from your collection of Korean natural farming inputs. All of these, except for indigenous microorganisms, are going to be great to add. Yes, most of them contain active biology, but the biology isn't particularly hard to get, like IMO is. So mixing in some fermented plant juice, some raw vinegar, some water-soluble minerals, some fermented fish amino acids, some OHN, these are all part of the suite of secret sauces that you can add to your piles. They're just gonna help round things out a little bit. They're gonna help you cover your bases with this burger. Not necessary ingredients. This is more of a use them if you've got them sort of thing. And how to use them is up to you. You could add them directly to the pile undiluted in small amounts and just trust that the water that you add is going to dilute them and carry them through the pile. I like to add them to a bucket beforehand or to my rain barrel and fill it up with water, and then use my watering cans to sprinkle them over and throughout compost piles. If you've made these inputs and maybe you made a little bit too much of a particular ingredient and you're never gonna get through it all, you feel like this is a great way to gradually redistribute them throughout the garden. The second piece you can add, what I'm calling the giblets, is biochar or pre-biochar. The giblets are your organ meats, liver, kidney, heart, that are really nutrient dense parts of these animals that we eat, but that in my culture as an American, we tend to turn our nose up at them. I'll admit that they're pretty hard for me to eat, probably because I didn't develop a palate for them when I was a youngster. Something that I am course correcting for my kids so they can love them when they grow up. Eating organ meats beyond the nutritional benefits is also just part of eating the whole animal, nose to tail, they say. It's probably a little bit more responsible to eat in this way, but the main reason that we eat these is for the added nutrition. Now, one way that some folks get these into their diet is by hiding them in the ground beef. So this is like grinding your own meat, including some liver in the blend. With biochar, we're adding a carbon source to our piles, but it's a carbon source that soaks up and houses microbes and nutrients. And so if we can incorporate this as we build our pile, we're sort of sneaking in extra potential for the finished product. Little goes a pretty long way. You don't have to add more than a fine layer of biochar every few layers or so within the pile. But when you do, the charcoal is going to add water retention ability to your compost. It's going to help microbes proliferate. It's going to help your compost retain nutrients. And overall, if you've got it, now is the time to use it. So the kimchi cheeseburger is assembled, secret sauce and giblets included. Now it's time to eat. We flip the pile multiple times, get that heat generated, and over the course of the next few weeks, we'll see that heat sustain and eventually fall off. And this is the sign that the nitrogen sources that we included in the pile have been spent, and the microbes that desire a balanced meal are going to slow down their activity. At this point, the thermophilic bacteria cultures are going to fade off and other cultures are going to come in and get settled in. And it's at this point that we have a choice to make. We could either ship it out to the field or the garden soil, or we could keep our hands on the wheel of the microbial vehicle. Composting is two things combined, right? Nutrient cycling and microbial cultivation, and both are super important, but one of those things is probably more important, at least from my gardening worldview. It's more important, and that is the microbial cultivation. That's kind of the main opportunity that we have here at this stage of composting. Younger piles are more about processing the easy to digest macronutrients, and older piles are about carrying out the microbial development to its further conclusion, which is fungal development. A compost pile that has just come down in temp is most likely going to be very bacterially rich, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a natural, beneficial thing. But if we think about this as a cheeseburger, which I've been demanding that you do for this whole video, a cheeseburger that has been chewed up, swallowed, and digestion has occurred, there are going to be parts of the burger that our digestive systems can't quite utilize, and so we poop them out. If you look at your finished compost and you see woody debris in there, and even just generally identifiable materials, those are things that could use further digestion. But the bacteria that help process the nitrogen-rich material so well can't quite work on. But fungi can. Now, if you take a scoop of this compost and plop it under a microscope, you'll hopefully see it a swarm with bacteria and probably some other good stuff, some fungi and protozoa and whatnot. But then let's say you fed it some molasses or a sugary substance. Under the microscope, you would most likely see those bacteria go crazy. At least that's what people who look into microscopes see. I'm not one of those people, but bacteria love eating up sugar and they will gladly consume it, multiply themselves, and then once that food source is gone, they diminish their population. On the other hand, if you were to just keep that compost damp and aerated over a long period of time, you'd see fungi start to crawl in there. One way to speed up that process, though, is to add a carbohydrate source for them that is not a simple sugar that's going to give the bacteria a rush, but that the fungi can start to feed on and break down and use as food and get their cultures more quickly established. Now, why would you want a fungal dominant compost? The simplest answer that I can give you is that there's most likely less fungi than there are bacteria in your garden. The exception being if you have a mature food forest or an orchard that you're never tilling in. Perennials feed fungi via root exudates and help them establish long-term fungal cultures in the soil. Bacteria are more the fast-acting microbes. They can come and go readily, but fungi can last for years or centuries if left undisturbed, which there probably aren't that many more of in this world. There's a giant honey fungus in eastern Oregon that's estimated to be at least 2,000 years old and up to 8,000. It covers 3.5 square miles of forested land, and it lives underground, mostly through its clusters of mycelium. It's also a parasitic fungus with creepily adaptive qualities. It can kill trees and then shift into a more saprophytic decomposition role. And honestly, it's beyond me to be able to explain this with much confidence. I just bring it up as an example of how a single fungus can live for a very, very long time. You wouldn't want this thing in your garden. What you would want in your garden would be something like what the Chilean Alerce forest has, where specific mycorrhizal fungi communities have been discovered living in unbroken symbiosis with trees that are over 2,000 years old. The redwoods in California are another obvious example where you'd find this kind of very, very old fungi. On the flip side, most bacteria have a lifespan of 12 to 24 hours. They reproduce as quickly as every 20 minutes under ideal circumstances, but single bacterium don't live really typically that long. Fungi, on the other hand, offer a very real potential for long-lasting microbial partnership in your garden, if you're willing to take the time to get them established. Now, if you're just making compost for your annual veggie garden, and you're going to be taking plants out of the ground each season and frequently disturbing the soil, it's probably not as necessary to go through the extra steps of encouraging fungal cultures in your compost. But if you're using this in a perennial setup where mycorrhizal fungi are going to collaborate with plant roots year-round and dive deep into the soil, it's kind of a different story. You really want to be cultivating these for a number of reasons, but primarily because they're going to be your trees and bushes and shrubs partners in the soil. So fungi are already present in your compost pile. They start to develop and reestablish as temps drop into the mesophilic temperature range, out of the thermophilic range, and now we can feed them to give them a little extra kickstart. A couple of examples for this would be to flip the pile, and then as you're mixing it back up, you sprinkle in some flour, some oats, some oat flour, some wheat bran, some form of complex carbohydrate, more complex than a sugary substance. And then just make sure that this pile is properly damp, of course, and over the course of the next few weeks, the fungi in the pile will relish their new, easy to digest food source. The fungi are also, of course, going to feed on woody material, so if you didn't use much wood material in your pile initially, this is a great time to add some. You can sprinkle in some wood chips or wood shavings lightly throughout the pile along with your flour. You can add in some of your Korean natural farming inputs as well at this point. And if you want to take it a step further, yet again, you can incorporate some of your IMO4, indigenous microorganisms, to set the direction for the fungal development in your compost. If this is your first time seeing IMO4, you might think, that looks like dirt, dude. And it's funny because that's what my 5-year-old son told me recently. He was sitting with his sister watching me and Cassidy filming a video on our K&F course. I was adding some IMO4 to a jar of fermented fish amino acids to show how it can speed up the process. And he just sort of almost like he was disappointed in me. He was just like, that's not IMO, Dad, that's just dirt. Just shaking his head. It's funny at the time. But you might be saying that right now, and I totally understand because there's no mycelium in sight, there's no mushrooms. Where's the fungi in there? And the answer is that it's sporulated. And if you're unfamiliar with fungi, when it reaches a certain point where it needs to preserve itself, its lineage, it triggers a reproductive burst where it collapses its cells and releases spores, which are tiny microscopic cells that contain the source code for that fungi. When you give these food and water, they spring back to life, and in some cases they need to sense plant roots in the ground who shoot out exudates that awaken mycorrhizal fungi. That's a pretty simple way of explaining it, but it's what I've got for now. Point is, this culture of indigenous microorganisms was something that I caught from a variety of sites in my general area, different elevations, and then I preserved it by desiccating the culture using brown sugar. I reawakened the culture by feeding it wheat bran and oats and wood shavings to make IMO3. And then I combined that with native garden soil to make IMO4. And you can check out my free beginner's guide to IMO to learn how to do this. You can also read about it in my book, A Home Gardener's Guide to Korean Natural Farming. Not holding anything back here. You can also check out our other videos to learn about the full process here more specifically and in-depthly. Point is, this quasi-finished compost is in a state where the fungal cultures can be drawn out and where it can be inoculated with other external fungal cultures. At that point, it can be used wherever. To be fully transparent, I don't take our composts this far all that often, probably once a year or so. This kind of fungi finished compost is something that you'd use more as a top dressing inoculating compost as opposed to providing bulk nutrients in the form of organic matter. And if there's any part of this process that you wish that I would go more in depth on, just let me know in the comments and I might be able to make another video breaking it down. In the case of the fungal dominant compost, we're sort of lengthening our digestive tract to be able to process a little bit more of the nutrients from our cheeseburger, and we're yielding a more microbially robust finished product. That's one use for your compost. But let's back up a little bit. Let's say that you were making compost that you were going to use to build a new garden bed with, or just to top dress a pre-existing garden bed with, that you're going to direct sow a tiny seed into. If you're transplanting a squash, you really don't need that fine of material. You can just sort of dig a small hole and plop in your plant start. But if you're sowing teensy carrot seeds or even radishes, you want a slightly finer texture, and that's where a sifter can come in handy. Especially if you have really chunky compost. There's nothing wrong with chunky compost, but it's not really the best for direct sowing carrots into, for instance. We use several homemade sieves. This one is a 1/2 inch hardware cloth, and this one is a 1/4 inch. You can sift your compost once to get the sticks out and pine cones, and then it's just about ready to use anywhere in the garden. You can sift it again through the 1/4 inch, and now it's ready to use for potting mix or seed starting mix, which is what we use it for. Your chunky stuff is totally fine to use as well, but you only really want to use it around established annuals that are thick based or around your perennials. Nothing wrong with it. It's all about what you're wanting to use your compost for. Now, a pre-step that you can take to get a finer graded compost and a quicker decomposition is that you can just pre-shred your materials. If you add clumps of stuff to the pile, you're gonna get clumps out the other end. It's like swallowing a pebble. There's only so much your digestive tract can accomplish before it comes out the other side. You'll know, if you follow us, how much we love our chickens for this purpose. They're grade A rummagers and breaker aparters of material. So we let them shred up stuff before we compost it. But if you've got a lawnmower that you don't mind dulling the blades of a bit, you can use that as well, or a leaf mulcher. Any amount of processing that you can do in advance will speed up the process of decomposition, creating a more ready-to-use compost material in the end. And try to think of this whole thing from a resource management perspective. You don't want to be sifting compost twice only to use it to fill an entire raised bed. It's just not necessary. You can use unsifted compost just fine and cut it with screamed topsoil even. Not my preferred route. I like just spreading it onto the soil directly, but that's because I like growing in-ground. Whatever you do, however you use it, and whatever state it comes out as far as its nutritional composition, its microbial composition, I want to encourage you to use your compost as something that you layer on top of your soil, not something that you mix into your soil. Unless you're dealing with super compact soil and you're going to till it, you just want to put it on the top. And the soil-like particles will find their way down into the soil naturally with the help of earthworms and arthropods and such. But if you do need to till, make sure that you aren't tilling in compost that contains a lot of woody material, because you can lock up nitrogen in your soil if you do that. When you use it as a mulch, something you spread out over the top of your soil, you really eliminate the risk of robbing nitrogen. It obviously needs to be in your soil in the first place at some level, but even if you have a pretty well-balanced compost with a healthy amount of organic nitrogen, you don't need to mix it into your soil for your plants to be able to access it, precisely because it's in an organic form, meaning that the biology in the compost will take on that distribution role. So what's the takeaway from this compost video? You tell me, because I'd imagine that there's some different parts of this process that stood out to different people. We talked through ways that you can prepare materials to go in the pile, how to assemble materials for a pile, additional materials you could add to the pile, what to do once the pile is formed, what to do once your pile is cooled off. At any or every point, you have an opportunity to enhance your finished compost product, and depending on your usage of that finished product and what resources you have available at the time of making it will determine how you make it. Hope this was interesting, and even more so, I hope you never look at a cheeseburger the same way. I also hope that there was a valuable takeaway in here. If there was, let me know in the comments. If you do want to learn a little bit more about IMO, which is one of the least explained parts of this process within this video, you'll want to check out my complete guide to IMO next. Thank you as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.